The column stops without warning. No shouting, no signal flare, just the hand of a man on point going up, and 11 other hands going up behind him, and then the whole line dropping into the tree line like someone cut a string. For a second, the only sound is water dripping off leaves and somebody's stomach growling. Then the word comes back down the line, quiet, almost bored. Take 10. Smoke 'em if you got 'em. That's it. That's the whole ceremony. A soldier who's been humping 60 pounds of gear through elephant grass since 0500 drops his pack against a tree root, digs into a pocket gone soft with sweat, and pulls out a crushed 4-pack with a book of matches tucked into the cellophane. His hands are shaking a little. Heat, adrenaline, both, and it takes him 2 tries to get a light. He cups it against the breeze the way he was taught without ever being taught. An old reflex passed down from men he'd never met. 10 feet away, another guy's already exhaling, head tipped back, eyes closed, like the smoke is the first thing that's touched him all day that didn't hurt. Nobody talks much. They don't need to. One guy sits on his helmet and picks at the laces on his boots. Another just stares back down the trail they came from, smoke drifting up past his face, watching for movement that probably isn't there. It's not a long break. 10 minutes. Maybe less if the radio crackles wrong. But for those 10 minutes, in the middle of a war, this is the only permission any of them has to stop being afraid. That ritual, that specific phrase, that specific pause, didn't happen by accident. The United States military spent most of the 20th century making sure a cigarette was never more than an arm's length away from a soldier. It paid for them, packed them, marketed them, and eventually, decades too late, tried to take them back. This is the story of how a habit became policy, how a vice became currency, and how the same institution that hooked millions of young men spent the next 50 years trying to talk them out of it. Go back to 1916, the U.S.-Mexico border, a company of soldiers sitting around in the dust between patrols. A magazine ad from that year shows 5 Army officers doing exactly what soldiers have always done on break, rolling their own cigarettes from a pouch of Bull Durham tobacco. The caption underneath is almost smug about it. Wherever you find a group of U.S. soldiers, you'll always find the makings. It wasn't just an ad. 2 years later, with the country fighting in France, Bull Durham sold its entire cigarette production to the War Department. The company rebranded itself the smoke of the red, white, and blue, and leaned all the way in. Soldiers in the trenches were getting a ration of 4 cigarettes a day, and by most accounts, General John J. Pershing himself said tobacco had become as essential to his men as their weapons. Whether or not he used those exact words, the Army believed it enough to build supply lines around it. Cigarettes weren't a comfort item smuggled in from home. They were logistics. They rode the same ships as bullets and bandages. By the time the next World War came around, the military didn't just tolerate cigarettes. It built them into the architecture of a soldier's day. Every K ration or C ration came packed with a miniature 4-pack of Old Gold, Chesterfield, Lucky Strike, or Camel, wrapped with a fold of waterproof matches, tucked in right alongside the crackers, the tin of meat, the powdered coffee. It wasn't an extra. It was on the same supply manifest as the food that kept a man moving. Some accounts put a combat soldier's total daily allotment, counting rations, sutler sales, and care packages, as high as 24 cigarettes or more. That practice didn't quietly fade out after the war ended. It kept running, ration after ration, for another 3 decades. Look at the photographs from that war, and the cigarette is everywhere, dangling from a lip in nearly every frame. It hung from the mouths of battle-weary infantrymen crossing rubble in Europe, from the cartoon faces of Bill Mauldin's Willie and Joe in Stars and Stripes, from the wounded laid out on stretchers in the newsreels that played in theaters back home before the main feature. One wartime magazine went so far as to call smoking the last and only solace of the wounded, the one comfort a medic could offer a man waiting on morphine or a stretcher or news about his leg. It wasn't dressed up as a bad habit. It was dressed up as care. The tobacco companies didn't need to be asked twice. They saw an entire generation of young men learning to associate their product with survival, with home, with a guy next to him in a foxhole, and they poured resources into keeping it that way. Camel ran ads insisting it was first in the service. Companies shipped cigarettes overseas by the millions, hired war-tested pilots and decorated veterans to front their campaigns, and leaned on the fact that a soldier's first cigarette of the day often came from the same box as his breakfast. Back home, mothers and sweethearts used their own ration points to buy cartons and mail them overseas, not realizing they were doing the tobacco industry's marketing for them. Even the men running the war smoked like it was part of the uniform. Franklin Roosevelt was rarely photographed without a cigarette holder clenched at an angle. Dwight Eisenhower went through 4 packs a day. Winston Churchill had his cigars. Douglas MacArthur his corncob pipe. If the commander-in-chief and his generals leading armies across 2 oceans couldn't put it down, it's not hard to understand why nobody thought twice about handing one to an 18-year-old 3 days off the boat. By the time Korea rolled around, the tobacco companies had turned brand loyalty into its own kind of campaign. Camel worked hard to become the cigarette of choice for the infantry, running ads aimed straight at men in uniform. It was policy, it was marketing, and it was habit. It all stacked on top of each other so tightly that nobody serving in those years could have told you where one ended and the next began. The phrase itself, "smoke 'em if you got 'em," carries more weight than it sounds like it should. It wasn't born out of comfort. It came out of scarcity. In the trenches of the First World War and the shattered towns of the Second, a cigarette wasn't always guaranteed. Supply lines broke down. Rations ran late. A man might go 2 or 3 days without a smoke and then suddenly have a whole carton dropped in his lap from a care package that finally caught up with his unit. So when an officer called out that phrase, it wasn't just an invitation to relax. It was an acknowledgement that this particular pleasure was never something you could count on. If you had one, you smoked it now, because tomorrow you might not. That urgency softened over the decades, but the ritual stuck. By Vietnam, it had become one of the few universal constants of a soldier's day. Marlboro, with its flip-top box, had overtaken every competitor as the cigarette of choice in country. Practical as much as anything, since that stiff little box held up in a way that soft packs couldn't survive a rucksack. Marlboro 4-packs came standard in the C-ration accessory packet, and soldiers got in the habit of tucking a fresh pack into the elastic band on their M1 helmets, riding right up against their skulls through firefights and river crossings and long stretches of nothing happening at all. It wasn't unusual to see a man reach up and pull a cigarette from his own helmet before he reached into a pocket. Not everyone bought in. General Creighton Abrams, who commanded U.S. forces in Vietnam, preferred cigars, a taste he'd picked up decades earlier commanding a tank battalion in World War II. It's a small detail, but it says something. Even at the top, tobacco wasn't optional. It was just a question of which kind. Go back one war earlier and the same competition was already running. In Korea, Camel poured money into convincing infantrymen it was the serious man's cigarette, the one a professional soldier reached for, as opposed to whatever a draftee's mother had mailed him from home. It's easy to laugh at now. 2 rival tobacco companies fighting over market share among 19-year-olds, freezing on a ridgeline outside Chosin. But the companies weren't wrong about the audience. A man who started smoking a brand at 18, cold and scared and far from anything familiar, tended to stay loyal to it for the next 50 years. That's not an accident of taste. That's what the advertising was built to do. What made the ritual matter wasn't the nicotine, it was the 10 minutes. In a job with almost no control, no say in the weather, the terrain, the enemy, or the orders coming down from somewhere above, a smoke break was one of the only moments a soldier got to decide something for himself. Light it, hold it, breathe it in at his own pace. Small as it was his. That's most likely where the modern version of the phrase comes from, the one people use now to mean seize the moment, use what you've got while you've got it. It didn't start as a motivational line. It started as a literal command given to exhausted men in the middle of a war, and somewhere along the way, the rest of the country borrowed it. Not every cigarette got smoked. Some of them became money. Richard Radford was a British Army officer serving in North Africa when he was captured during the fighting around Tobruk in 1942. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag 7A, a German prisoner of war camp tucked into the hills of southern Bavaria, holding tens of thousands of Allied prisoners behind wire. Life inside a camp like that meant long stretches of boredom, broken up by short bursts of fear, and almost total dependence on what came through in Red Cross parcels. Tins of meat, chocolate, powdered milk, and cigarettes. Always cigarettes. There was no job to go to, no ration line to work, no way to earn anything. Whatever a man had was whatever arrived in his parcel, and whatever arrived in his parcel was, for the most part, identical to what arrived in everyone else's. That kind of forced equality doesn't stay equal for long once people start wanting different things. Here's the strange part. Not every prisoner smoked, but every prisoner got the same ration. So a non-smoker in the bunk next to a 2-pack-a-day man was suddenly sitting on a stockpile of something everyone else wanted. It didn't take long for the camp to work out what to do with that imbalance. Cigarettes started functioning as actual currency. Not a metaphor for it, the real thing. A tin of jam cost so many cigarettes. A wash and men's service from another prisoner cost so many cigarettes. Men who ran informal shops out of their bunks quoted prices in cigarettes the way a corner store back home quoted them in cents. The camp even developed its own rough banking system, with men holding cigarette deposits for others and settling debts on delivery day when the new Red Cross parcels came in and the supply of currency swelled. It worked because cigarettes had everything real money needs and paper money in the camp didn't. They were uniform. A player's was a player's, no guessing at quality. They were portable, small enough to carry a small fortune in a coat pocket. They didn't spoil the way food did. And critically, everyone already wanted them, smoker or not, because they could always be traded for something else. When camp authorities tried introducing a paper script to formalize the economy, it fell apart almost immediately. Paper wasn't worth anything unless you could smoke it, and nobody trusted an IOU the way they trusted a pack of Chesterfield sitting in their hand. Radford watched all of this happen around him for years, and when the war ended, he did something almost nobody expects a former prisoner to do. He wrote it up as economics. His paper, The Economic Organization of a POW Camp, published in 1945, laid out exactly how a market, a currency, and even inflation and deflation had formed themselves out of nothing but desperation and cigarettes. It's still taught in college economics classes today, cited as one of the cleanest real-world examples of money emerging naturally, without a government printing it or a bank backing it. Just people trapped together, agreeing on what was worth something. It's a strange legacy for a product built to calm nerves. Inside those wire fences, a cigarette wasn't just something a man smoked to get through another day. It was the only thing standing between him and having nothing to trade at all. Radford's camp wasn't unique either. It was just one that got written down properly. Prisoners in other camps, other wars, other decades arrived at the same arrangement independently, because the logic never changes when you take away everything but a small, stable, universally wanted object. Give people scarcity and a shared craving, and sooner or later they'll build an economy out of it, whether they're economists or not. For most of the century, the military and the tobacco industry moved in the same direction, arm in arm. Then, sometime in the 1970s, the science caught up with the habit, and the two started pulling apart. By the mid-1970s, cigarettes disappeared from field rations for good. No more mini-packs riding alongside the crackers and canned meat. It wasn't a single dramatic announcement. It was the quiet end of a policy that had run, more or less unbroken, since before World War I. The reasoning was straightforward by then. The health data on smoking was no longer in dispute, and an institution that spends its budget training and equipping soldiers had started to notice how much of that same budget was going toward treating the men it had helped addict. But old habits, especially ones built into daily ritual for 60 years, don't die with one policy change. Cigarettes kept selling on base, in exchanges and commissaries, often cheaper than anything available off-post. And the tobacco companies weren't done chasing that market. When American troops deployed to the Gulf in 1990, Lorillard, Philip Morris, Brown and Williamson, and R.J. Reynolds were all still sending free cartons overseas, decades after the government had stopped doing it for them. The formal pushback picked up through the 1980s and 90s. Anti-smoking campaigns started showing up on base. In 1994, the Pentagon banned smoking inside workplace buildings. A 1997 executive order pushed it further, and by 2002, the Department of Defense had smoking cleared out of every government-owned, rented, or leased interior space it controlled. On paper, the military had gone from the country's biggest cigarette supplier to one of its strictest indoor smoking bans in the span of a single career. What it couldn't do, no matter how many memos it issued, was talk a generation of combat veterans out of the habit it had spent decades building into them. When defense officials floated the idea of restricting or banning tobacco sales on bases entirely, the resistance from active duty troops and veterans was immediate and loud. In 2014, Congress stepped in on their behalf. Representative Duncan Hunter's amendment to the Defense Authorization Bill blocked the Pentagon from banning the sale of any legal product, tobacco included, on military installations, on the argument that adults who'd been trusted with rifles don't need to be told what they could buy at the PX. Message boards lit up with the same argument in blunter language. One veteran put it about as plainly as it gets. Guys coming out of combat need something to help with the stress, and a cigarette break has been doing the job since before any of them were born. There's a real irony sitting underneath that fight, and nobody on either side seemed eager to say it out loud. The same institution now worried about the cost of treating lung cancer and emphysema in its retirees was the one that had spent most of a century making sure cigarettes were free, cheap, and everywhere a soldier looked. You can't hand a generation a habit for 60 years and then act surprised when the next generation defend its rights to keep it. The men pushing back on the 2014 proposal weren't wrong that they'd been treated like adults their whole careers. They just weren't naming who had done the original hooking. By 2016, the Pentagon settled on a compromise instead of a fight. Defense Secretary Ash Carter approved a policy pushing tobacco use outdoors and pulling the discount pricing that had made cigarettes cheaper on base than anywhere in town, without banning sales outright. It wasn't a resolution so much as an acknowledgement that the institution, which had spent 100 years handing out cigarettes like they were part of the uniform, couldn't just as easily take that back from the men and women who'd carried the habit through deployments the Pentagon itself had sent them on. Outside a VA hospital, most afternoons you can still find a small cluster of men standing together in a designated smoking area, 30 feet from the door because the policy says so now. Some of them are old enough to remember when the cigarette came free in the ration box, tucked next to the crackers like it belonged there. A few of them are young enough that they picked up the habit somewhere far more recent. A deployment, a helmet strap, a 10-minute break on patrol that never made it into any history book. Nobody calls out "Take 10" anymore. Nobody has to. They just step outside, light up, and stand there quietly for a few minutes. The same ritual their fathers and grandfathers learned in places with names like Bavaria and the Ladrang Valley, minus the officer who used to give them permission. They give it to themselves now. It's the one piece of the old routine the policy never managed to take away. Not because it forgot to, but because some habits get handed down so many times they stop belonging to the institution that started them and start belonging to the men who carried them home. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what part of this story surprised you most. And I'll see you on the next one.
Let's go, Smokes. Let's go, Smokes.
You don't even smoke, Bubbles.
Give me a smoke, hairdo.
It's starting to run out.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?